Welcome, everybody. That's it. Welcome to the New Yorker Festival. We are delighted to be here. It's the 10th festival, and we're really happy about that. Every year, all of us on the staff look forward to this event as a chance to talk to some of the people that we have written about, and mostly to meet and appreciate the readers of the magazine, to whom we are very grateful. And we have a great group today. I will introduce them briefly. It is my fond hope that you will hear a great deal from them and very little from me. I will be asking some questions, but I certainly encourage all of you to jump in and don't wait to be recognized. This is not meant to be a formal Robert's Rules of Order kind of occasion. So let me introduce everybody. First, we're a little out of order. David Boies, who is the founder and chairman of the firm of Boies, Schiller and Flexner. He is a well-known lawyer in many respects, but for present purposes, he is known as the co-lead counsel in the Proposition 8 case in California, where Judge Von Walker struck down Proposition 8. And for my money, the certainly most extraordinary fact about December 12th of this year is that it is the 10th anniversary of Bush v. Gore, which David received the silver medal from the Supreme Court in. Brian Brown is the head of the National Organization for Marriage. Welcome to the Lion's Den, pal. Anyway, so he is a supporter of traditional marriage between a man and a woman, and it's, I think we tried to balance the panel a little better than this, but we failed, okay? So Clarke Cooper is the executive director of the Log Cabin Republicans, an organization charged with building an inclusive Republican Party. We'll ask how that's going. And Gene Robinson is the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire. The first openly gay bishop in the Anglican Church in the United States. And I think you know who Cynthia Nixon is. Cynthia Nixon, welcome, is an actor, political activist, winner of 2 Emmys, a Grammy, and a Tony. And we are delighted to have her here today. And I'd like to start with you, Cynthia.
Terrific.
Why is same-sex marriage important?
Why is same-sex marriage important? I think it's important for a lot of reasons. I mean, for me, it's important because I want to get married to a woman. And I want our family to have all the legal protections that men and women who are married to each other have. But I think it's also very important to gay people who have no interest now or ever in getting married. Because I feel that when the law views different categories of people differently, and it sends a message to, I think, the worst elements in our society, that somehow this second group, which is not fully entitled to all the benefits that straight people have, that somehow this group is lesser and perhaps not fully human. And I think it gives them the right to discriminate against this group of people. And I think in the most heinous cases, if they're looking for somebody to bully or beat or even kill, I think the society and the government sends them a message that here's some people that you can pick on, and we're really going to look the other way.
Brian, same question. Why is it important?
Well, it's important because there are consequences when you redefine marriage. I mean, we'll hear a lot tonight about equality and rights, but we like to take the argument seriously. If this is about equality, and as Cynthia said, if those of us that believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman are the equivalent of bigots, then the law is going to treat us that way. And therefore, in places like Massachusetts, you've seen Catholic Charities Adoption Agency essentially shut down by the state because it could not, according to its religious beliefs, adopt children to same-sex couples. You've seen in New Jersey, in the Ocean Grove Methodist Association, which would not allow a pavilion it owned to be used for same-sex civil unions, to lose part of its state tax exemption. In place after place, when you redefine marriage, it isn't simply a live and let live scenario. You're putting into the law a powerful new idea that there is no morally relevant difference between same-sex and opposite-sex couples, and those of us who think that there is are essentially the equivalents of bigots from the 60s. Now, the African-American community doesn't by and large accept this argument, but it is made time and time again. So don't say, we're going to redefine marriage, it doesn't affect you, there won't be consequences, when at the same time you're saying that those that don't agree with this new idea of marriage are the equivalent of racists and bigots.
Bishop Robinson, the subject of marriage is very much intertwined between the civil world and the religious world. The legal cases, the law cases about same-sex marriage only deal with the legal side. Certainly, I think if Proposition 8 is struck down, you are never going to have a church forced to conduct a same-sex marriage, but you can't deny that many marriages certainly are conducted or take place in houses of worship. How do you, as a member of the clergy, think about the difference between marriage as a religious institution and marriage as a legal governmental institution?
I think this is at the very center of the debate at the moment. Things have gotten very confused in this country because we have deputized clergy to be agents of the state in the conducting of marriages. And so when people go to a wedding, they don't know where the civil part begins and ends and where the religious part begins and ends. Indeed, I have encouraged my own clergy in New Hampshire to get out of the marriage business. What makes you married in the eyes of the state is a signature on the marriage license. It doesn't prescribe what words you have to say. In fact, you don't even have to say any words. You just need to have it signed and sent back to the town clerk. In France, for instance, everyone gets married at the mayor's office, and then religious people go to the house of worship of their choice if they want that blessed. So, interestingly, because I believe in the separation of church and state, I think it's important to look at the fact that when we talk about church and state, we're usually worried about the state impinging on the rights of the church. But in this case, we have the church, or the synagogue or the mosque, trying to enforce its values on the secular state. And I think we need to separate those two.
Can I just follow up on something you said? You have asked your clergy not to perform weddings anymore?
Right. We actually, what the church does is to bless marriages. And in fact, in our prayer book, we have the blessing of a civil marriage. That's actually what the church does. What clergy do for the state is to serve in the same capacity that a justice of the peace does. And there is nothing written anywhere that says clergy need to be doing that. It's very clear to people when their marriage comes apart and they go to get a divorce, they don't go back to the little sweet church around the corner to get the divorce. They go to the courts. So it's very clear.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to just pursue this too much, but I mean, don't you have parishioners who say, look, I want to get married in my local church? Isn't that and are they disappointed? I mean, what do you say to them?
I think it's going to take some education. Yeah, it does come as a shock because it's obviously the church that's been encouraging them to get married all these years. But for instance, I mercifully live in New Hampshire, and so I'm married to my husband. And what we did was we had the civil contract, if you will, solemnized at the back of the church, sort of where the secular world and the sacred world meet. Our female Jewish lawyer effected that union. And then everybody went back into the pews. We went up the center aisle. And then we did what the church does, which is to celebrate that. The community pledges its support for that couple and its stability and its love for one another. It promises to hold them accountable for the vows they've taken. And then the church blesses that marriage.
Clarke, let's talk a little bit about politics, because you are, a member of a Republican Party organization. Now, in 2004, Karl Rove very explicitly made a decision to encourage as many states as possible to hold referenda on same-sex marriage to drive conservative turnout. And it was a pretty successful strategy. but one that I think was offensive to a lot of supporters of gay rights. Where does the log cabin Republican stand in the contemporary Republican Party?
Sure. Actually, things have evolved since 2004, partly because there was a huge diminishing return from that. It was wrong on principle because it created a wedge issue, it was divisive in the party. It actually made gays and lesbians second-class citizens in the views of some of the folks in the party. And part of the diminishing return is we lost voters, or the movable middle, or voters under 35. So there's been a collective recognition, regardless of where Republicans stand on the issue of, say, marriage equality, that those tactics in 2004 did not win in the long run. There's been a internal look in the military. We call it an AAR, an after-action review, not only after 04, but more recently the 08 cycle. We had our teeth kicked in 08. I was in the Bush administration for 8 years, and after being...
Say what you did.
I was a diplomat, and it is kind of interesting to sit next to David because I'm glad you lost that case in 2000. But I'm glad you won Perry versus Schwarzenegger. So
1-1.
It all works out. It comes out in the wash. I was a diplomat for President Bush in several postings. And my last posting, I'm happy to say, was here in New York. I love being posted at the UN, though the UN drove me crazy. But it was a great experience to be in a multilateral environment. But moving forward to what you were asking about, this cycle is a very interesting cycle for the Republican Party because it's an opportunity for the party to go back to regain lost voters, Republicans essentially, and also gain new members of the party by focusing on the basic core tenets, what makes a conservative small c, individual liberty and individual responsibility. And if one looks at those as bookends, individual liberty and individual responsibility, that is a giant Venn diagram for many people to fall under. And under that, you can break down into things like limited government, tax reform, less taxes, a market economy or market growth, a strong national defense, again, a confident foreign policy that advances U.S. interests instead of apologizing for them. So those are common denominators that most Republicans across the board and conservatives who may be identified as independents or libertarians or in some cases Tea Partiers can coalesce on. There is still some difference or delta on things like equality measures. So what we're doing in that bridging sense is working with the party, and we've said will help advance pro-equality candidates. These are Republican incumbents and challengers out there who have either a record or taking a position for things like marriage equality.
How many Republican senators, there are 40, support marriage equality?
Well, it depends on the definition of that, because some of them, but this is a dialogue we're having within the party, and this is a dialogue that took place.
How about use the biggest one you have, and how many would support them?
There's probably about 5 or 6 I can count on that would, on the definition of marriage equality. Now,
that's actually more than I thought. I mean, because there are, give or take 41 Republican senators.
Yeah, but let's go back to the term marriage, and this goes back to the separation of church and state. I believe, based on what I've heard from elected Republicans and those running for office, that if the definition from a civil status was just that, and I think where people get wrapped around the axle, get upset about the definition of marriage, is the religious connotation or connection to it, and that it is not truly a separation of church and state. That is something that has been discussed in conservative circles of, well, how can we move forward with this? Maybe we should rebrand it instead of calling it gay marriage, marriage equality, maybe talking about a civil status, which actually is exactly the same thing as marriage. So it's interesting you ask that question, because that is an internal dialogue that's taking place. I will say that for most elected Republicans, they're more likely to support ENDA or co-sponsor ENDA than they would say.
Well, translate that.
It's the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, because again, at the base level, even though there may be a divide on some of the social issues amongst conservatives, no Republican that I'm aware of would want someone to lose their job based on their sexual orientation, because again, there seems to be a greater realization that orientation is not a choice. It's like I didn't choose to be bald either. So, and members are starting to come around to that. So there's varying degrees. Again, some members are more comfortable with, say, supporting repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell than marriage equality. So I go back to, there is a bigger dialogue as to not just are you for it, are you against it, as President Bush would say. What are you for as far as?
Great to have President Bush quoted. You don't get that a lot, but I'm sorry.
But so the definition of what instead of saying marriage, creating another term, but again, focusing on that separation of church and state, I think will help move this forward at a greater level.
David, every time any state has had a referendum on same-sex marriage, it's lost. Whether it's in a liberal state like California or Maine, sometimes it's been closer, sometimes it's been bigger, but the voters have spoken so far on this issue. Why should the courts overrule the people in this case, on this issue?
Because that's what we've got courts for in this country. If we didn't have the courts to enforce minority rights, we wouldn't need a constitution. We could just say, okay, whatever the majority decides at any given point in time. Do we want women to be able to work? Let the majority decide. Do we want blacks and whites to go to school together? Let the majority decide. Do we want women to be able to own property? Let the majority decide. Do we want to say who can be employed as a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher? Let the majority decide. The whole point of our Constitution is that there are certain fundamental rights that we don't put up to majority vote, because we believe that this society, if it's going to be a truly inclusive society, is going to be a society in which the majority rules on most political matters. But there are certain fundamental rights that are protected for everybody, whether they're popular or unpopular, whether they're minority or majority. And that's what made this country different than a lot of other places. One of the disagreements that I had with the Bush administration was the idea that exporting democracy by itself was a great idea. Democracy without the rule of law, without the protection of minority rights, is no better than mob rule. What we have in this country is a combination of democratic principles on the political level and protection of minority rights, which the courts give us. And if we ever depart from that, that diminishes not only the group that gets discriminated against at a particular moment, but it diminishes us all, because we are all threatened when we lose the protection the Constitution gives us for fundamental rights.
One of the things that Judge Walker said in his opinion was that Prop 8 reflected irrational bias against gay people. That irrational bias is shared by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and anyone in the country who does not support same-sex marriage. Is that fair, that characterization of a majority of the citizens of California, the President of the United States, the Secretary of State?
Well, I think that I would hope, maybe it's overly optimistic, but I would hope that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and other people, if they felt they really had a free choice in the matter and were not catering to what they thought were political third-rail issues, would say things that are different. I've said many times that it's a point of somewhat embarrassment to me that my Republican co-counsel is righter on this issue than my Democratic president. I hope that we're going to move the political system ahead. I think we are. I think that what's happened since 2004 in the Republican and the Democratic Party has been a sea change. When you have Glenn Beck going on television and defending gay marriage, you've seen something that has changed remarkably in much less than a decade. I think there's a recognition on the part of conservatives, on the part of libertarians, that you don't want the government telling you who you're going to sleep with, who you're going to be with. I think questions of individual liberty that are at the heart of the conservative movement are now coming to the fore. And some of the predilections from the past are being set aside. And I think that's true in both the Republican and the Democratic parties. I think it's certainly true among young people. I've got my children barely understand what this issue is about. I have a grandchild that's 22 years old, is in college in California. He came up to watch the Proposition 8 case. He couldn't figure out what in the world this was happening. Why in the world this was a question of why in the world, he would say, does the state want to prevent two people from getting together and being happy? What conceivable purpose is served by that? And if you look at any of the polls, this is something that is going to be history. This battle is over. It's just a question of how soon people get equal rights.
Brian, jump in about that.
Yeah.
Because there is one of the things.
Where do I start?
Well, no, but
Like
one of the things that is striking. Let me just to frame it a little bit. One of the things that is striking when you look at the polling data about same-sex marriage, as opposed to most political issues in this country, the division is not so much by party, race, it's by age. Mm-hmm. That you basically see overwhelming support for it among people who are 18 to 24, and then the number goes sort of down, and older people are definitely more opposed. So why is David wrong that this is just a matter of those political attitudes seeping through the years?
Well, first let me do a little experiment here. There's six of us up here. There's only one of me representing the position of protecting marriage. All of you out there, would you raise your hand if you're willing, those of you who support same-sex marriage? I like that.
Oh, this is New Yorker readers, baby.
Now, the reason I did that is because the marriage issue is clearly one of the best examples of an issue in which you have a total division between elite and popular opinion. Most elites, whether in academia, whether in the legal profession, and many in politics, have moved in the direction of accepting some of these glib assessments of same-sex marriage, that this is about equality, there aren't going to be any effects, there will be no consequences, or you go further and you accept Judge Walker's opinion that those of us that believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman are simply irrational. So here in New York, you clearly have a majority of people who accept that you can redefine marriage. And the statements that are put forward are accepted very easily because there's a sort of groupthink. But when you go to California and you're told, like David just said, this fight's over. There's no way you'll pass Proposition 8 in California. We were told that in the beginning of Proposition 8. And then after Proposition 8 passed, in Maine is a deep blue state, we were told. The voters in Maine are pretty strongly Democratic. They're not going to accept this. And all of the elites were talking to each other, saying, we've moved beyond this. This is not a big issue anymore. And they were wrong. The people of Maine overturned their legislature and protected marriage as the union of a man and a woman. And that is because there are a number of lies being told repeatedly in this fight.
Such as?
Number one lie, same-sex marriage is inevitable. Same-sex marriage is not inevitable. The reason that this meme is put out is in order to take those few of you out there who know that marriage is the union of a man and a woman and strip you of your will to fight for something that is so important. Number two, that there aren't rational bases for the idea that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. This is a simple, common sense idea shared throughout human history in civilizations, societies much different than our own. That it takes at least one man and one woman to make a marriage. That marriage is that fundamental institution that brings the sexes together and that connects mothers and fathers with any children they may bear. Those are the two functions of marriage. The state doesn't create those functions. The state doesn't create marriage. Marriage is a pre-political institution. It exists in cultures that have states or politically organized very different than our own. So the notion that the state is somehow creating marriage and you have this distinct division between civil and religious marriage is simply wrong. The third big lie, it's connected with the lie that Judge Walker put forward as far as the notion that there is no rational basis for marriage, is that somehow those of us that believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman are the equivalents of racists in the 60s. We're bigots. And this is one of the most powerful lies. Well, I hear a yes out there.
Let's listen.
This is one of the most powerful lies because equality arguments throughout American history have been powerful. Now, laws against interracial marriage were wrong because they kept the races apart. Marriage is good because it brings the sexes together. But if you are going to treat us, and if you are going to use the language that is being used, even on the stage today, that we are full of hate, that we are irrational, that we are bigots, then don't be surprised when the government powerfully intervenes to punish repress, and marginalize an idea that it views as profoundly against basic democratic norms. That is what our government does with racism right now. Now, in America today, you can be a racist. You can go out there and be a racist. Can you have a radio broadcasting license and operate your radio station along openly racist lines? No.
You can make a ton of money doing that.
Well, the government won't. The government won't allow it. Can you run your medical practice for professional licensing along openly racist lines? No, of course not. The government has stepped in there. The 800-pound. The last point. The 800-pound gorilla in the room is: can you have a 501c3 tax-exempt organization and run it along openly racist lines? No, you cannot. I think that's a good thing. But once you take me and the millions of Americans, the 7 million Californians who voted for marriage as the union of a man and a woman, all of their religious organizations, and put them in the exact same position as racist organizations, can they have a 501c3 tax-exempt status? Well, if you accept this analogy, no. So don't say that there won't be effects.
Let me just jump in. Cynthia, let me ask you something, because I'd like you to follow up on something we just heard, which is, this is New York, it's liberal, it's of course everybody supports same-sex marriage, but you were active in the fight to get same-sex marriage through the New York State Legislature. And even in New York it lost. And not even by that close a margin in the state Senate. As someone who was involved in that fight, why do you think you lost?
Well, I have to say that I went and lobbied prior to the vote, some months prior to the vote, and I sat in the offices of about 8 different state senators, some Democratic, some Republican, and there were people that I spoke to who I could tell were going to and wanted to vote yes if the vote was going that way. And I think what happened, sadly, is we got some no's, even from Democrats, right in the A's. And I think people were like, I'm going to run and I'm going to save my skin.
It's just wonderful to see profiles encouraged like that, isn't it? Just if the early part of the alphabet goes against it, forget it.
I think it's very interesting, and I found it very interesting when I was in these senators' offices, and then I found it very interesting watching the vote on YouTube as I did afterwards. And the senators who were voting yes had a lot to say and had a lot of feelings about it and opinions and about maybe this was an easy vote for them, maybe this was a hard decision to come to, and they talked about their thinking and they kind of analyzed it and shared it with the other people in the chamber. And the people who were voting no, there was only one senator who got up and said anything at all. And I think it's because people who are now against same-sex marriage have very little to say. I mean, other than
Brian.
Other than like a particular a particular wing of a particular charity will not be able to use a national park. I mean, I think we're really reaching for it. And to me, it's very clear that the more the groups that oppose same-sex marriage speak about it negatively as wanting that gay people are somehow sick or lesser or should not be entitled to these privileges, they lose their audience right away. So the only thing they really have to say is, we're the victims here, and we are going to be deprived of our right to define marriages between a man and a woman. The people who are for same-sex marriage want to redefine marriage. And I want to say to the gentleman to my left, gay people who want to marry have no desire to redefine marriage in any way. When women got the vote, they did not redefine voting. When African Americans got the right to sit at a lunch counter alongside white people, they did not redefine eating out. They were simply invited to the table. And that is all we want to do. We have no desire to change marriage. We want to be entitled to the same, not only the same privileges, but the same responsibilities as straight people.
David, I sort of cut off before, and I'd like you to address one of the points that's come up here. Sometimes it's sort of, what happens if gay marriage becomes legal?
Right. I think that one of the great advantages of a court case is that unlike a panel and discussion where everybody gets to talk, each side gets to cross-examine the other. And as I've said before, the witness stand is a lonely place to lie, because whether you're on my side or the other side, you have to stand up and you have to be cross-examined. And when we started the trial in California, we said we were going to prove three things. We're going to prove that marriage was a fundamental right. And we almost took that for granted because the Supreme Court has held that on a number of occasions, and has held it entirely unrelated to issues like having children and raising children. The Missouri passed a law that said people that were in prison for life, where they were prohibited from having any contact with spouses or anybody else, could not get married. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's unconstitutional. Because even though these people are isolated, even though these people cannot have any physical contact, even though they obviously are not going to have any children or raise any children together, the marriage relationship is so important that it's a violation of the Constitution to deprive these lifetime felons of the right to do it. The second thing we said we were going to prove was that marriage was something that was important to gays and lesbians and to the children that they were raising, and that if you deprived them of the ability to marry, you harmed them in significant ways, and you harmed the children that they were raising in significant ways. Hundreds of thousands of children being raised by gay and lesbian couples. And we proved that, not just from our witnesses, but on cross-examination from the defendant's witnesses. Every defendant expert that I cross-examined admitted on the stand that depriving gay and lesbian couples of the right to marry hurt them and hurt their children. And the third thing we said we were going to prove was that there wasn't any evidence at all that allowing gay and lesbians to marry harmed heterosexuals in any way. Now, you would think that would be obvious. I mean, how many of you are heterosexuals?
You're not obligated.
Okay, you're not, but just as
volunteer.
An outing here. An outing by David Boies.
Okay, how many, let's see the hands again.
We have all these extensive editorial debates. Can
Okay.
we do that?
Now,
It's like,
that's
no, we're
pretty good.
have
Okay,
people
now-
raise their hand. No?
Now, how many of you want to get married to somebody of the same sex? The heterosexuals? No, I'm sorry. I meant of
I
the
was confused
heterosexuals.
too.
Of the heterosexuals. How many of you heterosexuals want to get married to somebody of the same sex? How many gays and lesbians in here want to get married to somebody of the opposite sex? Opposite sex?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Now,
I was confused too.
okay, it's a confusing set of questions, but the point is that people want to stay with their sexual orientation. This is a matter of choice. This is something that you do, and if you are a heterosexual and you want to marry somebody of a different sex, you're not going to change your mind because you're gay or lesbian married. A couple down the street can get married. You're not going to decide, think of, I've got children, okay? Think of the children. They fall in love. They decide they want to get married. Then they say, oh no, I've just found out that my gay friends are going to be able to get married, so I don't want to get married. That's so contrary to common sense that you would think that wouldn't be an issue. But we made it an issue, and we put in evidence on the issue. Courts do a lot of things, proving things that you think are obvious. And from the witness stand, the defendant's own experts admitted they had no evidence that allowing gays and lesbians to marry harmed heterosexual marriage in any way. The things that are said here about the danger of gay marriage is not from gay marriage. It is that if you allow gay marriage, then you're going to somehow prevent me from having a radio station. You're going to prevent me from doing the kind of charity work that we want to do. Those two are not connected. There's no reason that they have to be connected. The Constitution, in the First Amendment, has two parts in terms of religion. One is the anti-establishment clause that says You can't impose your religious beliefs on anybody else. And you can't use the state to impose your religious beliefs as to what marriage ought to be on the rest of the country. But it also has a free exercise clause that says nobody can tell you how you exercise your religion. And if you had a religion that advocated, for example, racial division, I don't think there's any case in the country that has ever suggested that you could not advocate that as part of religious instruction.
Bob Jones University.
No. What Bob Jones wants is Bob Jones wants the taxpayers to pay for it.
So you accept that they shouldn't have a tax-exempt status?
What I'm saying is that when you begin to engage in that kind of speech, you can do it on your own if you want to, but don't ask the American taxpayer to pay for it. Now, in terms.
Let me answer.
Okay, wait, but I think.
No, go ahead.
Let me. Can I jump in? I mean, I think the point maybe that Brian's making is that there's a famous Supreme Court case that says Bob Jones University, which explicitly discriminates, can't get tax deduction. It's okay if they're denied tax deductions,
right.
Tax exempt status. If gay rights is on the same level as racial discrimination, will Georgetown University, which is a Catholic institution, not be able to get preserve its tax-exempt status?
Well, I think that if you're going to take the government's money in order to educate people, then you're not going to be able to say, I'm going to educate some of these people and not other people. I think it's very different from radio stations, churches, and that kind of thing, where you have freedom of religion, you have freedom of speech. But if you're taking the government's money in order to educate people, you can't say, I'm going to educate this group of people, but I'm not going to educate that group of people. That comes from being on the public dole.
Brian,
yeah, this is so profoundly against our entire tradition of religious liberty, the notion that you are going to punish religious organizations for their beliefs, and bringing forward the idea that somehow this has to do with not allowing certain people to attend. That has nothing to do with it, David. It's not about not allowing people to attend. It's saying that, for example, if Georgetown's a good example. If you have a same-sex married professor, and as a Catholic institution, Georgetown can never recognize same-sex marriages as marriages. And the state comes in and says, well, you're not recognizing this as a marriage because you're not giving benefits to this same-sex, quote-unquote, married couple. Then the state can come in and yank your tax-exempt status. Now, I'm not saying it's more complicated than this, but I am saying that logically, the argument being put forward that equates those of us that believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman as racists will inevitably and logically lead to this. But there are many more reasons why David's wrong.
Okay, but actually, let me ask Bishop Robinson to jump in here, because this is one of these areas where religion.
Can I finish one? I understand I'm taking up a lot of time,
okay.
but I have.
Yeah, no,
I'm arrayed against a lot of people. Now,
afraid.
Jeff, I know you're against me on the issue, but you're very good.
Oh, thank you. I'm exquisitely neutral.
No.
Just go ahead. Anyway, just go. But I really want to ask Bishop Robinson this question.
I want to stay on the religious liberty thing. The notion that it's only me or activists supporting protecting marriage that have pointed to the emerging conflict between religious liberty and same-sex marriage is just demonstrably false. I encourage everyone to look at a book, Same-Sex Marriage and Religious Liberty, Emerging Conflicts. And Doug Laycock, who himself supports same-sex marriage, lays out very clearly that there are conflicts. So this notion that this is just made up is absolutely false. There are clear conflicts. Now, you can say, as someone out here just said, am I a bigot because I believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman? And they shout out yes. Now, you can say that, but don't say that organizations and individuals won't be treated differently because of their belief.
Bishop Robinson, what's your take on that?
Before I answer that, it's been a long time since I've spoken. I've only spoken once.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's true.
And I want to I'm going to start by saying I find it amusing and thoroughly offensive for you to paint yourself as a victim, and for people like you to paint yourself as a victim. Wait. No. I want to say why. For someone who has experienced so little discrimination, to paint yourselves as the victim of those of us who have actually experienced discrimination for so many years is mind-boggling to me. Second of all, you mentioned marriage as being this time-honored, going back forever institution. You know, that's how change happens. And how change happens is you have a worldview that pretty much defines the world. And then you have an experience for which that worldview is not sufficient to explain. And you're kind of thrown into some chaos. And you come out on the other side either denying that that experience happened or with a revised worldview. The fact of the matter is the worldview about marriage has been the same for a very long time. And because so many of us have come out, and so many of us are loved by our families and our friends, we've been thrown into a kind of chaos in which we're coming out on this other side. And progressive religious people are changing their minds about this, and it's in our greatest tradition. Slavery was in our worldview for a very long time, and we even used Scripture to justify it. And we figured out that the church, not God, but the church, got it wrong. And the subjugation of women was used, we used Scripture to justify that, and we figured out we had gotten it wrong. Not that God felt that way, but that the church had gotten it wrong. And the question we're trying to figure out now is whether or not we might have gotten it wrong about this. And I would argue that more and more of us are deciding that indeed we have gotten it wrong.
Well, can I answer?
Well, no. But before we, I'd like you to address the more specific issue of, what happens if the government has to take same-sex discrimination into account in its relationship, broadly defined, with religious universities, religious hospitals, religious charities. What?
But I think you've got to sharpen the question, because if it's taking into account in terms of the relationship with the institution as a religious institution, that's one thing. But if it's taken into account in terms of its relationship to it as an educational institution, as an employer, we have laws that prohibit employment discrimination. We have laws that prohibit people from being barred from restaurants, hotels, educational institutions. That is different from the issue of religious freedom, even though some religions may operate hotels and universities and other things. And I think you really got to ask the question when you're talking about the effect. Are you talking about the effect on the religious institution as a religious institution, or are you talking about the effect on the religious institution as an employer, as an educator, as a hotel operator?
Bishop Robinson, can you address that issue as someone who helps run a church?
I have absolutely no fears about this because the church is free. The church, the synagogue, the mosque is free to follow its own tenets religiously. The problem is if my church is accepting public money to run a particular program, then I have to follow the public's values in accepting that. Nobody's making me take the money. Just, for instance, I would say that the Roman Catholic Church was not forced out of the adoption business. They chose to get out of the adoption business because of these
So the state says, first of all, that's just false. It's just factually false to say it was because they were taking money. It had nothing to do with taking government money. In Massachusetts, you cannot discriminate and also have an adoption license. So it has nothing to do with taking money. In England, recently, the last adoption agency of the Catholic Church had to be shut down. And I will say that the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church, sided with the Catholic Church there in saying that this was wrong. Now, to answer your specific personal question, to say that it's offensive and absurd, I'm sorry it's offensive, but part of this debate has gotten to the point where we personalize everything. I don't think, I wish the best to everyone. I condemn hatred or bigotry to all. But I will say that in the wake of Proposition 8 And anyone who attacks a homosexual or does anything of that nature, we've condemned immediately. But in the wake of Proposition 8, the passage of Proposition 8, we had Mormon temples defaced. We had donors getting phone calls at their homes with death threats. I myself just
this is
got
where
off
you
of
need
a bus
cross-examination. This is just where you need
No,
cross-examination.
let me finish my sentence.
Right,
I just got off.
Let him finish, and then we cross-examine. But I want to ask Clarke something.
I just got off a bus tour in which protesters attempted to shout down the Catholic Bishop of Madison, Wisconsin, as he was saying the Lord's Prayer, who stormed the stage right up to my face and said, "You have no right to be here in Providence, Rhode Island, and speak." The notion that somehow this is live and let live, and that those of us that believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman haven't been subjected to attempts to silence us is simply wrong. It's factual. You can look it up. I encourage you to watch the video. But if we're going to have a debate on the issue, let's have a civil debate. Let's not attempt to personalize it and say that people are attacking.
This is as civil as it gets. David, what were you going to say in terms of sort of factual issue?
Well, first of all, this idea that supporters of Proposition 8 were harassed and death threats is just foolish.
Well,
And I say to you, anybody who wants to, read the trial record in our case, because people came into court and made those kind of allegations, and they were subject to cross-examination. And you know what we found? We found there were 3 or 4 examples that way, and we found 50 or 60 examples the other way. You see people getting shouted at. People get shouted at a lot in America when they're talking.
The entire cable news business is based on
shouting.
Right.
So shouting down a Catholic bishop as he's trying to pray is okay.
And I suggest to you that if you look at the crowds shouting against marriage equality, and you look at the crowds favoring marriage equality, you will see the former much louder, much violent, much more threatening than the people supporting it. And all you have to do is look at those pictures. But
your case doesn't have anything. Your case doesn't have to do with this. Look at the protect marriage versus.
Okay, wait, let me let Clarke jump in.
Yeah, we have a flight example in the District of Columbia. I'm proud to say that even though I'm a Floridian and my roots are in New York, that I live in a jurisdiction where marriage equality is legal. Now, what we forgot to cover on this is that here's an example that I think, Brian, you're going to appreciate. The Episcopal Diocese, I happen to be a constituent of Bishop Shane, who's a colleague of Bishop Robinson's. The diocese in Washington, it's legal to get married, but the diocese is not forcing every parish to do marriage rites or blessings, because not every parish in that diocese supports that. So it's not being shoved down the throats of Episcopalians in Washington, D.C. I know Bishop Shane sent out a memorandum, or what is it, an edict?
We don't do edicts.
Whatever. Sorry, Your Grace.
But was it like an email? Or
a memo. But so the case in point, every parish had the opportunity to democratic small d vestries could decide if they wanted to bless marriages or not. I happen to be in a parish that chose not to. It opted out. Now, what the clergy did is they came and said to folks like myself, I'm still single, when you're ready for your blessing, there are parishes within our diocese that will do so. So it's legalized in the District of Columbia in a legal sense. It is not being shoved down the throats of the clergy of the different denominations. And so we somehow had lost that. That's an applied example of how it is working.
But I've never made the argument that churches are going to be forced to perform same-sex marriages by the state. That's not the question. It's in any area where the church enters into the public square where you're going to see conflicts of law. So D.C. is a very good example. When the Catholic Church, through Catholic Charities, enters into the public square, part of living out its gospel message through Catholic Charities, providing the poor and the needy with sustenance, those employees of Catholic Charities receive health care benefits. Only married employees do. When D.C. passed same-sex marriage, the Archbishop Worrell, pleaded for a religious liberty exemption. Pleaded. He was absolutely denied by David Catania. So what happens on passage of same-sex marriage? The church has to stop giving health care benefits to married couples because it was going to be forced to give the same benefits to same-sex married couples. Now, health care benefits is a question, but it's forcing the church to do something against its deeply held beliefs.
Cynthia, let me just change the subject.
Can I just say, I feel the entire thing is being hijacked by Brian talking about the terrible things that straight people are going through. We're not even talking about the things that gay people are going through. And surely this is what this is about, you know?
Right. Well,
integration was not about white people and the horrors that were going to happen to them.
Again, the race analogy. The race analogy.
Right,
the race analogy is incredibly apt.
It's totally inept.
Cynthia, let's just talk about sort of you come out. You're not a litigator. You're not a politician. You're an artist, and you come out of the world of popular culture. There seems to be sort of a broad consensus that popular culture is sort of one of the more liberal institutions in America. And, you know, I wonder how you have experienced going out into the world as a political figure. Do people embrace you as, you know, someone who has political views, or are they resentful of a, you know, celebrity telling them what to do?
So you're talking about in the political world?
Well, yeah, sort of out there in the political world. When you go meet with senators, meet with state senators, meet with voters.
I feel that when there are people in the public eye who are gay and who would like to talk about gay issues, it's particularly useful for one reason, and that's people know me. And there are people out there in the world, most of us have a gay friend, a gay neighbor, a gay teacher, a gay employee, a gay employer. But for people who actually live in a world where they don't know any gay people, or they don't know that they know any gay people because the atmosphere is so oppressive that those gay people are not comfortable coming out, it is very useful for those people to see an actor or a writer or whoever it is, because in a certain sense they know that person. And in a certain sense, once you, I mean, the thing about this prejudice is, it's like any prejudice. You can sort of vilify a group of people. But once you know one or more of those people, and you see that they're just a person like you, and their family is just a family like your family, even though your family might have a mom and a dad, and my family has 2 moms, all of a sudden they think, oh my gosh, what was I trying to do? Why was I trying to prevent you from leaving your Social Security benefits to your spouse should you die? How can that help my family? That only puts your family in jeopardy, and I don't want to put your family in jeopardy.
Well, by the way, we're going to go to questions from the audience pretty soon, but I'm sorry. Go ahead, David.
Let me say one thing about that, because I think that's exactly why you see this very sharp cleavage in terms of age, in terms of how you view marriage equality and these kind of issues. People like me who grew up, and unfortunately people who are most of the judges are about my age, grew up not knowing very many gays or lesbians that were self-identified as gays or lesbians. In 1956, Dwight Eisenhower issued an order that prohibited any gay or lesbian from being employed by the federal government. You couldn't be a mail carrier, you couldn't be a secretary, you couldn't be a type clerkist if you were gay or lesbian. That attitude infected the people who grew up in that era. The thing that has happened is that my children, and particularly my grandchildren, are growing up with people that they know who are gays and lesbians. They're normal people. They are their teachers. In some cases, they're brothers and sisters. In some cases, they're aunts and uncles. In some cases, they're parents. They're their doctors, they're lawyers. And that knowledge of learning, of being exposed to people, is what changes people's attitudes. When you know somebody, your attitude about them is different. You're driving down the highway and somebody cuts you off and it's a stranger, you'll yell and scream. If it's somebody that you know, you'll laugh and wave at them. the thing, maybe not necessarily, but our society has always had great ideals of equality. You read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and it defines equality in really great terms. The problem was that back then, who we met as the people inside that circle were essentially white male property owners. Gradually, what we've done as a country is expand who we are. And they has gotten farther and farther outside the edges. And we brought in people who didn't own property, and then we brought in women, and we brought in different races. And now, essentially the only group in our society that is defined by law as being outside are gays and lesbians. That's the last bastion of really official discrimination.
Clarke, let me ask you. If you look at any issue involving gay rights, whether it is same-sex marriage, whether it is adoption, whether it is foster, whether gay couples can be foster parents, as it was in Florida, a big, very controversial issue there, you see that the leaders of the movement against gay people, against gay people's interests, are invariably Republicans. How can you be in the Republican Party?
How can I be? That's actually very easy to answer. This goes back, kind of ties into the generational issue that we just were talking about. And Laura Bush actually recently addressed that on your network about the fact that anybody who's a baby boomer or older, and she and former President Bush are baby boomers, didn't have the experiences of growing up with people who are out or having people out in their family or out in their communities. And so one, going below the baby boomer generation, I happen to be Generation X. We've got millennials now, post-millennials. The numbers show the direction is toward not just tolerance, not acceptance, not caring. It's a non-issue like David's grandchild. So how this ties into being a Republican, one of the things that I go back to the core values we were talking about earlier. At the beginning of this dialogue, I was talking about the two bookends, individual liberty, individual responsibility. I firmly believe in that. Every Republican does. The Republican Party needs to go back to its base, its core. So we've actually kind of veered off course. And I do believe that for any kind of positive change or effect or growth within the party, it has to come from within. And if I'm not doing it, and if my fellow log cabin Republicans aren't doing it, no one else is. Because the truth is, for any kind of dialogue to take place, it has to take place within our own ranks. Because no offense to the rest of the folks up here, but, this is where Brian and I are divided within the party. But anyone who's not a Republican, it's kind of hard to make a case for any kind of growth in the party when you're not inside. So you have to be within to do that, to affect positive change. And that is my mission. Those are my marching orders.
Bishop Robinson, let me ask you sort of a similar idea, a question about a similar idea, which is, obviously, as we've heard here today, religions have played a crucial role in the whole issue of gay rights and certainly on same-sex marriage. Your own church, as you know better than anybody, has been riven on these issues. What is different about persuading people in a religious context about equal rights for gay people that's different from, say, a political or a legal context?
I discovered something in Scripture that I'd probably read 10,000 times, and only a couple of years ago did it leap out at me. This is from John's Gospel, and it takes place at the conversation at the Last Supper. Jesus says this really quite astounding thing to his disciples. He says, "There is much that I would teach you, but you cannot bear it right now. So I will send the Holy Spirit who will lead you into all truth." I think he was saying, for a bunch of uneducated fishermen, you haven't done too badly. Not the sharpest knives in the drawer, but really, you're going to do remarkable things. But don't for a minute think that God is done with you. And God, through God's Holy Spirit, is going to lead you into all truth. And I think we have certainly seen that in the civil rights movement and the women's movement and so on. And I think the church right now is trying to decide if indeed this is the leading of the Holy Spirit. What we do know is the sermon that David just preached, which is that God will continue expanding that little circle that we draw between us and them, keep expanding it until there is no more them.
Exactly.
And what an extraordinary honor to live in a country that embodies that message in a non-religious way in its very constitution. And so I think in terms of changing religious hearts and minds, and let's be clear, 95% of the discrimination and pain that LGBT people have experienced has been at the hands of religious people. And someday soon, maybe before even the end of my lifetime, we will see the church repent of that, and it must. But in the meantime, we have religious people searching their hearts and trying to ally themselves with God's will that there be no more them. And so I think that churches and synagogues and mosques are trying to ask the question, could this be something that we've gotten wrong for a very long time? And might it be the Holy Spirit indeed leading us into the truth?
And with that, I would like to invite our audience to ask questions. I believe we have people with microphones. Raise your hand. The only thing I ask is that you ask questions. Please don't give speeches. And where are my... Oh, there we go. Oh, we're going to have people sort of walk over to the microphones. Wow, we are so together. Fabulous. Go for it, please. Go ahead.
This question is for Mr. Boies. I'd like to ask you, what are the chances that you think this is going to wind up inevitably before the Supreme Court, number one? And number two, how do you think this court, as currently constituted, would vote on the same arguments that were presented in California?
Oh, what a great question. I was going to ask it myself. Go ahead.
Well, Ted Olson and I have a deal. He's going to get the 5 justices that he got in Bush v. Gore.
That's true, actually.
I'm going to get the 4 justices that I got in Bush v. Gore, and we're going to have a unanimous court. Alternatively, we're not, and this is serious, we're not taking any justice for granted on this issue, and we're not giving up on any justice. I think that properly explained, this is an issue that is not a conservative or liberal issue. It's not a Republican or Democratic issue. I think one of the signals that Ted and my combination on this case hopefully sends is that this is something that all Americans who believe in the Constitution and believe in equal rights ought to be behind. And I think that if this case gets up to the Supreme Court, I think that we have a good chance of convincing them. I will never guarantee anything as long as the judges who are hearing this are the judges who grew up when I grew up, because I know the baggage that we carry with us. But I think that this is an opportunity for judges to step outside of those predilections and decide it on constitutional grounds. And the very best justices that we have do that, both as liberals and as conservatives. And I think, just 30 seconds more, I think there's a chance this case doesn't get to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. I want it for my next book. Are you kidding?
Yeah. The case on gay marriage will eventually get to the Supreme Court. But I think the case coming out of California, there's a good chance that the case doesn't get there. The Court of Appeals has already suggested that the people who are trying to appeal it don't have standing. This is a technical legal issue as to just who can appeal. Usually in these cases, the governor or the attorney general is the person appealing, and they clearly have a right to appeal. Whether the proponents of the proposition have a right to appeal is going to be one of those kind of legal abstractions that lawyers and judges will argue about. It won't affect the merits of the case. It won't affect this issue eventually getting up to the Supreme Court, but it could mean that it's not the California issue, it's the next case.
Yes, sir.
My question is also for Mr. Boies, and it's slightly different to the one to the one that was just asked. There are gay rights organizations all around New York that have been in existence for decades.
Could you step a little closer to the microphone so we hear?
Sorry, there are gay rights organizations that have been around for decades in New York that I suspect many of the people in this audience give money to, because we trust those organizations to know when the time is right to bring litigation that affects our rights and our futures. Your lawsuit is extremely exciting, and your victory in California is impressive. But can you just say something about your relationship with those organizations,
Sure.
given the tremendous risk that you are putting all of us into?
Sure. There was a
Can I just sort of clarify that? That's a very important question, but there's a little background here. There are several gay rights organizations who are interested in the cause of same-sex marriage favored a strategy of going state by state and worried that if you brought this issue to the United States Supreme Court now, this court as currently constituted would give you a bad decision on the issue of same-sex marriage, so it was better to go state by state rather than risk a bad decision in the Supreme Court.
They actually fought, they were against going to court.
Well, anyway, David, just go ahead.
But at the time we brought the case, we talked to a lot of the people who had been fighting this fight for decades. And there was a division of view as to whether now is the time to bring this lawsuit. And from our perspective, we thought it was the right time for several reasons. First, we had 4 clients, a gay couple and a lesbian couple, who wanted to get married. And it's very hard for a lawyer to say to a couple, wait, now is not the right time. Your generation doesn't get marriage equality. Hopefully it'll come in another generation. The second thing is that the state-by-state process was either legislative or it was based on state law. Neither of those avenues would be affected by a United States Supreme Court decision on federal law. We weren't asking the United States Supreme Court to decide state law issues. The way you could be hurt by a bad United States Supreme Court decision is if the court said something that was, in effect, anti-gay rights, that they went beyond just interpreting the Constitution as a ground of federalism and made an attack on gays and lesbians as a group. We don't think that is likely. I am confident that you're not going to have a majority of the Supreme Court sign on to those kind of attacks. And as a result, we thought that even if we lost, it would not set back the state-by-state strategy. The third thing that we thought was that we were going to win. We thought the time was right. Not because we had a majority of American people that would necessarily vote for it, although it's getting closer and closer, but because we believed that the people in our judiciary had learned enough about this issue to understand the importance of extending equality to this last group that are outside of the boundaries. And we brought the case in the Ninth Circuit because we thought that was a place that was hospitable, that we'd get a fair trial. And we thought that when it got to the Supreme Court, hopefully we would have a record that the Supreme Court justices that follow the law and follow the evidence would find it impossible to reverse.
Yes, go ahead.
But let me just say, there are a lot of people who have spent a lot more of their time, life, safety fighting this issue than Ted and I have, who disagreed with that, and we respect those views enormously. There's no doubt in either Ted's mind or mine that our ability to do what we did in California is the result of what a lot of people have done for a long time.
Yes.
Hi. So there's been a lot of concern today about religious institutions having to compromise their fundamental beliefs if gay marriage extended benefits to any of their employees. And I'll take the example of the Georgetown and their educational setting. And yet I think Georgetown probably extends benefits to their divorced employees. And so I'm wondering if there's a corollary here that for any concern for those institutions have to compromise any of their core values. Well, I think the Catholic Church has already addressed that with divorce. And I'm wondering if you think that's an appropriate corollary.
Brian, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it is at all. Marriage, not only for the Catholic Church, but for the overwhelming majority of Christian churches in this country, also Orthodox Jews, most religious traditions, is something that is so core and is not going to change. It simply is not. And the government coming in and saying that Catholic Charities Adoption Agency has to now treat same-sex marriages as marriages strikes at the heart of religious liberty. So the notion that somehow it's some side issue is just wrong. It strikes at the heart of religious liberty. And I think that the court is going to see this. I think that the early folks, the Human Rights Campaign and the other groups that opposed what Ted Olson and David Boies were moving forward with a federal suit, I think they were right. There's been a lot of triumphalism because of Judge Walker. That decision is not going to stand. Fact 75 basically spells out exactly what I've been saying all night about the threat to religious liberty.
What is
Fact 75? He has 80 facts that he lays out in Walker's decision. And in one of the facts, he says point blank that essentially that the discrimination and animus that same-sex, that homosexuals have felt is due to religious traditions. And then there's a footnote that lists the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptists, and one other church. So in the decision itself, it specifically says that religious beliefs harm gays and lesbians. That isn't going to stand. A lot of what I think that what is going to happen is that you're ultimately going to lose at the Supreme Court. I'm very confident of that because of the grandiosity of the decision. But even if that doesn't happen, say that the Supreme Court says that same-sex marriage is now the law in the land and throws out the votes of 65 million Americans, the 7 million Californians, everyone else. We have same-sex marriage throughout the country. Do you seriously think that people that firmly believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman are not going to push for a federal marriage amendment? That is exactly what's going to happen.
That's not conservative. That's an incursion on states' rights.
Okay,
well, after the Supreme Court...
I just really want to let a lot of people ask questions, so let's just keep going.
I've got to add 30 seconds.
Okay.
Because,
back forth.
because you cite that finding. What you don't say is that one of the things that Walker cites is that finding came not from what we said, but from what the defendant's witnesses admitted. It was the defendant's witnesses who admitted that this discrimination was religiously based. And I know because I cross-examined them.
Well, I've read the record. They cited the very points that Walker points to. Of course, we know that the Catholic Church does not believe that homosexual acts are good. The Church has taught that. Of course, we know that. Are you saying that because the defendant said that, that's why Walker put this into the record?
I'm absolutely saying that this judge wrote his opinion based on the evidence in the case, and the problem that you're fighting, and I sympathize with it, okay, is that you have this view, and I respect the view as being genuine. The problem is that there just wasn't anything in the record. They had 3 weeks.
This is another completely false.
Let's continue.
So my question's for Mr. Brown. You've spoken a lot today about how you believe same-sex marriage will victimize the opponents of it, but you really haven't spoken at all as to the validity of this opposition. Could you please just tell us why, in principle, you oppose same-sex marriage?
Well, primarily because marriage is a fundamental good that brings together the sexes. It's both unitive and procreative. It brings together the two great halves of humanity, and it connects them with any children they may have. Every known human society throughout history has accepted the fact that it takes at least one man and one woman to make a marriage. Now, those Americans who voted for Proposition 8, or the overwhelming majority of Americans that share my view, they do not, for the most part, hate. They love this institution. They believe that this institution is good. They believe that this institution, it provides great benefits to children and to society. And that's the reason they stand up repeatedly and vote for it. So if your fundamental premise is that gender matters, rather than the fundamental premise put forward by Judge Walker and one of his other facts that gender roles are now completely irrelevant, and if you accept that if you want to change an institution that is as primary as marriage is, then you have the onus of proof upon you to show how this change is going to be good, how it's not going to have the sort of consequences that I've laid out. Then, of course, you're going to stand up and vote and work to protect marriage. This is the thing.
Okay,
we believe as much as you do. We believe as much as you do that this is a rights issue. This is an issue of civil rights. This is an issue of the common good. And so, even though we disagree, let's not come at each other and say you're irrational, you're full of hate. We just disagree.
All right, let's just get more questions, because I just feel I want to have more questions, and I'm the moderator.
Thank you. My question is about the economic argument of tax-exempt status. I'm a tax attorney from Orange County, California. I have a wife who stays at home and raises our children. In that capacity, I get 2 large subsidies from the federal government. By filing a joint return, I save thousands of dollars a year in taxes. And if I die first, I know that my wife will get a much higher, perhaps $20,000 more a year in Social Security benefits. Those Americans who are not allowed to marry can't get that benefit. How do you balance that economic benefit against your charitable status argument?
Our New Yorker readers are smart, man.
That's good. Very good question.
Go ahead and answer that question.
That's an excellent question.
Good question.
Any two people have the right to live as they choose. If we want to look at the way people are being treated poorly in the law, we can look at specific ways of remedying that. I don't believe, however, well, what I mean is that, for example,
Anyway, keep going.
There's a microphone where?
No, it's back on. It's back on.
No, you can address the issues separately, discreetly, without redefining marriage. But I do believe,
all
I will say,
1,100 rights that I'm being denied right now by DOMA, we can address all 1,100 of them one by one?
Well, no.
Hell will freeze over before we do that.
My next point is that I will say that I do believe that the function performed by marriage, the union of a man and a woman, is something that the state it's in the best interest of the state to lift up that unique union. I think it's unique and special, and I don't accept the idea that 2 men or 2 women are the exact same thing as a man and woman united together in marriage. I don't accept that. So of course I think that you can have different benefits or different arrangements, and that marriage deserves these things bundled together in a different way.
Next question.
But wait, I'm sorry.
All right, Cynthia, go ahead.
I am in exactly the same situation as this gentleman who asked the question. I have a woman that I live with who I intend to marry as soon as it's legal in New York, who I consider my wife. She is a stay-at-home mom with our kids. And yet, she cannot receive my Social Security should I die. She cannot, there are 1,100 plus benefits that even if we married, even if we went to Connecticut and married, we could still not, because of the Defense of Marriage Act, receive. And it is not right. And you know, you are entitled to your opinion that somehow your relationship with your wife and the children that you have is somehow different from my relationship with my fiance and the children that we have. But you're entitled to that right, but you are not entitled to deny me those 1,100 plus federal benefits.
Next.
I'm interested in what Mr. Boies said about the kind of secular functions of certain institutions and the religious functions of them. And for instance, Georgetown University, it's often been cited. Say, for example, that you win and Prop 8 is struck down. But there continue to be universities, schools, other charitable organizations that have as their official credo certain things. If they cite the Bible as an important text in their, to their purpose, what have you. where's the dividing line between a Bob Jones, who is going to be denied his tax-exempt status, and someone who will retain it? Is it in their actions? Is it in their deeds? Where do you draw the line? If I'm not an expert on the Bible, I'm an atheist, but if they have words in their religious documents that can be interpreted to be bigoted what's the
David?
I think that really is a great question, and I think it's important to focus on the fact that prohibiting bans on gay and lesbian marriage doesn't resolve any issue with Georgetown or the Catholic Charities or anything else. That is an issue either under state law, if it's a state question, or under federal law. Those are separate questions. And there's a tendency on some people, maybe not you, but on some people who are opposed to gay marriage to come up with this parade of horribles of things that they say are going to happen if you allow gay marriage. Because they don't really want to debate the issue of whether you ought to prohibit a gay couple or a lesbian couple who are in love from getting married. Because that doesn't hurt anybody. And so they try to come up with things that are going to be changed or are going to hurt people. And those things are all a different question. The courts will deal with that. The legislatures will deal with that. It doesn't necessarily follow from any decision that you make in terms of gay and lesbian marriage. All that we're dealing with in Proposition 8 is should the state be able to discriminate between who gets married based on sexual orientation or the sex of the people involved. And if there's no rational basis for that, if it doesn't hurt anybody, then you can leave to another day the issue as to what happens with Georgetown.
Next question.
Thank you. I'm just for the record, I'm in support of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say thank you.
Could you aim the microphone a little closer to your mouth there?
That good? Hi. I just want to say thank you to everybody here, including Brian. Because honestly, the more that you speak on your position, the more archaic and ridiculous people realize it is. And I also want to say, I will ask questions. I wanted to ask everyone, how long must we wait for LGBTQI people to receive their civil rights? I'm currently working with a small group who's doing a vigil outside of Senator Gillibrand's office called Queer SOS, which is asking Senator Gillibrand to file a bill called the American Equality Bill, which will add sexual orientation and gender identity into the '64 Civil Rights Act. And I want to ask you, Mr. Boies, how you feel that would play out.
Can I just go to your first question and ask Bishop Robinson? Talk about how long this is going to take. I mean, you seem optimistic, but be specific. How long do you think it's going to take, assuming you think gay rights will assume its place with race, religion, and other forms of discrimination that are no longer tolerated?
See if I can do this quickly. I think there are two parts to the change that we're looking for. The definition of an ism, is prejudice plus power. So the prejudice of white people over people of color plus the power to put that in place equals racism. You can do the same with sexism. What we're dealing with here is heterosexism. I never use the word homophobic. I think it's a conversation stopper. It shuts people down. So you've got the prejudice that values heterosexual people at the expense of homosexual people, plus the power to make that the law of the land and the custom and so on, equals heterosexism. I think that's a word we ought to start using more. I think we will achieve the taking away of that power. That is to say, I think the laws will change soon. Look how much change we've seen on this in a short period of time. No civil rights issue has made this kind of progress this fast. I would again attribute that to how many of us have come out and people know us and they don't believe the lies anymore that are told about us because they know that they're not true.
Right, Bishop, look how many straight allies we have here.
Exactly. And that's when civil rights movement take off, is when the members of the quote-unquote oppressor class realize that they are paying a price for the oppression as much as the people being victimized. But what will take a very much longer time is that when we've settled the power piece, that is to say when we've changed the laws, the prejudice will still be there. Just because we took Jim Crow laws off the books in the 60s doesn't mean racism has gone away. Or just because girls can, play Title IX sports doesn't mean sexism has gone away. So that piece of it, will be around for a very long time.
Can I just ask? Go ahead. No more people other than these folks should ask.
On the legislative arm, you asked about Senator Gillibrand. First things first. There's some, to use a metaphor, there's a lot more wood to chop right now in Congress. So they still on their plate when they come back, because they're gone, by the way.
Yes,
they took off for the elections. When they come back, they still have to address repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the great, ginormous defense authorization bill when they have a lame duck session. The next Congress, they're going to take up the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which is ENDA.
Right.
There's a big bipartisan interest in that, because like I said, that's a basic. People need to work. Everybody wants jobs. Both Republicans and Democrats are talking about jobs.
Yep.
So those things are going to happen first. Not to say that the senator's bill is going to get any traction, yes or no, but that's the wood that needs to be chopped first. Repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the defense bill, and then the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And then, back to the tax issue, there are Republicans who are pro-equality Republicans who think that a good toe in the shallow end on equality measures is to address tax inequities in the next Congress. So there's some interesting things coming our way, and look for them and get co-sponsors for
Yes,
that.
sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi. So I just want to keep it basic. I was hoping if all of you, in 1 or 2 sentences, keep it brief if you're capable.
No all questions for everybody.
Okay. I don't know who to direct it to. I was hoping somebody could define what marriage means to them, what it is. We haven't really heard that today.
Oh.
I mean, that could be brief, I think.
Cynthia, you talked a little bit about this.
I think that marriage has many private and public aspects to it. But I think when you decide to marry a person, you decide that you want to share everything with them, and you want to share it with them not just today, not just this year, but until one of you dies. So you live with that person, maybe you have children with that person, and you include that person in every decision in your life, big or small, and you want that person to be able to visit you in the hospital and make medical decisions for you if you are not able to. You want that person, if that person comes from another country, you want that person to marry you and be able to join you in the country in which you live. You want to be able to leave all your money to them without exorbitant taxes, and you want to be seen by your friends and by the world at large as an indissoluble unit, a family unit, and I think that I think that we all should recognize that a couple who want to. It's not like gay people are asking for the right to, I don't know, graffiti on the wall, like gay is great or something. We're asking for certain rights, but we're also really asking for responsibilities, because that's what marriage is. We're not asking for a get-out-of-jail-free card or a, $200 when you pass go. We're saying we should be entitled to make this commitment to that other person that we love and to the world at large. This is the person that I'm going to spend my life with, and this is the person at my side. Please take note.
Yeah, and straight people are, we're a tough act to follow since we've been so good at marriage.
Could I just take a very quick religious try at marriage, which is it's when you make the decision to make a place in your heart for another person and to try with everything in you to love them as much and possibly even more than you do yourself. And the reason that it has been thought to be a sacrament is that sacraments are a place where God promises to show up. And the church has always believed that in that struggle to love another person, even more than you love yourself, there's a tiny window into the heart of God and God's selfless love for us. And I think that is just, I happen to have been married to a woman and to a man, so I've experienced it both ways. And what I can say is that indeed it is a sacrament, and it does give us a tiny glimpse into God's unimaginable love for us.
Yes, sir.
My question is for Brian. I wanted to also thank you for coming. It does say a lot to come into the lion's den, like we said before. I think it's actually quite admirable that you're here.
Thank you.
My question is, you were saying that it does take one man and one woman to make a marriage. I've been racking my brain over this, and the only thing that I can think that it takes a man and a woman to do is make a baby. And I'm hoping that you can give me a few more specifics of what it takes one man and one woman to do that two men and two women cannot within a marriage.
Well, the reason that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, there's really three primary reasons. And that is that, number one, most of us are drawn to an act that may result in children. Not all of us, but most of us. And number two, societies need children. We know what makes babies. Societies need babies. Number three, children, when a child is born, there's bound to be a mother present. But fathers have to be connected with mothers and to any children they may have. And the institution that does that for societies that are very different than ours, whether we look in Africa 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago on the steppes of Asia, whether we look at societies that are tribal, that have nation states, that are dynastic, societies across the board have this institution called marriage in order to connect mothers and fathers together, husbands and wives together, and to connect fathers especially to mothers and any children that may be born. That is, in my view, why marriage is one of the very few nearly human universals that we have. There are very few nearly human universals, and this is one of them.
Okay, I'm sorry, I haven't jumped in, but I can't resist. And I know we're getting late, but I mean, lots of people who get married, straight couples, for medical reasons or reasons of age, they can't have children or they don't want children. What does that do to
That doesn't do anything
argument?
to my argument. I mean, there's a level of silliness that comes out here when there's this claim made that because you believe that marriage is unique because of the procreative potential of marriage, that therefore only couples that may have children, in my view, should be able to get married. That's absurd. That has not been the case. That should not be the case. Marriage has two functions. It's unitive. It brings together the two great halves of humanity, and it has the potential for procreation. Those two aspects are fundamental to marriage. Now, even in marriages in which no children are born, the unitive aspect of marriage is present. But I will say that in those marriages also, if for example, they're infertile, often people that are infertile decide to adopt. And in those situations, you have both a mother and a father. So in my view, gender is very important. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives. Now, you can disagree with gender being important, but the basis of the view that there's something unique and special about marriage is that gender is important.
Okay, next question.
You can tell that I'm of the generation of David and Jean. I'm
Stand a little closer.
I'm also a heterosexual woman, and I am most definitely in favor of marriage equality. And Brian, are you aware that there's a whole big situation in which same-sex marriage would, would support and make even stronger heterosexual marriage? And that is the situation wherein two people, man and woman, marry. They may even have some children. And then at some point, one of those people says, "Dear, I'm sorry. I can't stay in this relationship any longer. I'm gay or lesbian." And then the straight spouse person's life is turned upside down. Sometimes they have a wonderful person like Jean to help them through that trauma. But very often, they do not.
You know what? I think we should. Let's just go on to the next question. I think that was an interesting statement, but it was more of a statement than a question. So let's have another question.
My question is for Bishop Robinson.
Can you direct the microphone?
My question is for Bishop Robinson. And you mentioned I thought this really eloquent way of explaining the worldview and situations that don't explain that and how we reevaluate that and get to either agree with what we thought before or move on to something else. And I'm an Episcopalian. I'm from Minneapolis. I was at the convention
Yay.
When you were appointed. And I just wonder what your insight looks like in how that evaluative process is happening right now in the Episcopal Church in particular, and in many different institutions, the Republican Party, kind of all these places where we're reevaluating how to connect these two situations and how to navigate that in a way that's civil and productive.
Yep. Jane Tully, who is the wife of Bill Tully, the rector of St. Bart's Church here in New York, says that what's happening in the Anglican Communion right now is what happens in a family. You know, the kid comes home and says, "Mom, Dad, I'm gay." The family's thrown into chaos and is asking the question of how expansive can its love be? So the gay kid, the Bishop of New Hampshire, comes home to Dad, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and says, "Dad, I'm gay." And now the family is trying to decide. In such a context, I think the greatest sin is walking away from the table, walking away from the conversation, which is why it's so great that Brian is here, because we have to keep talking to each other about this. My experience in the Episcopal Church is that we have finally decided that this is the church God is calling us to be, and we're willing to pay whatever price it takes. To consecrate a gay bishop once might have been an accident or an aberration or an exception, but we have now elected and consecrated a second openly lesbian, or the first openly lesbian bishop. And in doing so, I think the Episcopal Church has said, we understand, we're trying to be as sensitive as we can, that not everyone agrees with us, especially around the world, but we feel this is who God is calling us to be, and we're going to be it as best we can, with as much humility as we can. I think other denominations are looking at us to see how we fare, and the reason we are making progress is that this is a live issue in every denomination, no matter how clear they are about their opposition to sort of liberalizing themselves on this. You know, I led a retreat for 75 gay Roman Catholic priests. You know, this is a live issue in the Roman Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Church. So it's part of my reason to be optimistic. And for Episcopalians, my God, we've seen Episcopalians running for their Bibles. When was the last time Episcopalians, ran to find their Bibles?
Yes, sir. Last question.
This question is for Mr. Brown. I was wondering if you could clarify just once more your rational basis for the argument against gay marriage. As best as I could tell, you had 4 points, which were that, number one, it was procreative, number two, it was unifying, 3, it was the way it's always been, and number 4, because you know it to be so. And I wonder how you can, sit on the same stage with Mr. Boies, who laid out, a very methodical, fact-based argument that was, argued in court and cross-examined, and how you can, call that a rational argument. If you could clarify that and give us maybe a more fact-based approach to why it is that there should not be gay marriage.
Well, I think that, again, as everyone here, when I asked you to raise your hands, there's a lot of uniformity of opinion, and that's fine. But I think that you've accepted part of the uniformity of opinion on the Proposition 8 case, and I think it's just fundamentally wrong. I think that there was plenty of evidence introduced during the trial. The evidence may not have been in the form of witnesses, but it was through cross-examination and documents. There are reams of documents that were submitted, and the fact is that Judge Walker ran the trial as a show trial and essentially a kangaroo court. And at the end of the day, he produced as findings of fact things that were clearly not findings of fact. Now, David may not want to bring this up, but in every higher court where Judge Walker, in every higher court that this case has gone to, Judge Walker's been overturned. In fact, he's also been mandamused. Judges go throughout their whole lives without being mandamused. He was mandamused in the Ninth Circuit. Why? Because the way that he ran the trial, first of all, he attempted to live broadcast the trial in order to shame and make this even more of a show trial for those of us that believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. The U.S. Supreme Court had to step in under emergency injunction, which was granted. So the notion that rational arguments for marriage were not presented at at the trial is simply wrong. There's a great piece coming out, I believe, in the Harvard Review of Public Policy that Robbie George has written on the rational basis of marriage. Go to our website. A lot of the arguments that I've made here about the nature of marriage as far as the consequences. But I want to ask you all this. All of the arguments put forward here about love and about what the nature of marriage is, and the claims of rights. If two people love each other, why should the state say that they can't get married? Logically, what if I say that I love 3, 4, or 5 people? Why not? But why not? Even if you don't agree, I'm not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow in the United States, although if any of you have read Beyond Marriage, a statement of many scholars, they claim that polyamory should be recognized.
Okay.
But I'm just asking you, why?
We're going to do polyamory at next year's festival.
But let me answer you.
I think this
Why
whole
not?
panel should be able to marry itself.
There we go.
Why not?
Let David just respond about the trial.
Okay, I mean, I think there are about 3 things, and I'll try to keep it real short. The first thing you may notice is that you did not get an answer to your question. The second thing is that Judge Walker is one of the most respected judges in the federal courts in California. He's the chief judge of the Northern District of California. And when the opposition's only argument is an ad hominem attack on the judge, you know what the record evidence shows. The third thing is that in the one example that was given on the televising of the trial, I would say 2 things. First, what was reversed by the Supreme Court was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. That is, Judge Walker's decision had been affirmed by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, including by the chief judge of that circuit, who's a very conservative judge. Good judge, nevertheless, but a very conservative judge. And this had broad support on both liberal and conservative judges because people believed that in a case of this importance, the public ought to be able to see what went on. And if the public had been able to see the evidence, you wouldn't have the kind of arguments that are being made here because everybody would have been able to see what went on.
We are way over time. I am going to say thank you to Clarke Cooper, David Boies, Cynthia Nixon, Brian Brown, and Bishop Dean Robinson. Thank you all for coming.